So I'm the head of the Intech Center on Climate Adaptation, which is housed completely within the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo. And the primary focus of the facility is to address climate change and extreme weather risk in Canada, with a primary focus on flooding. What do we do to address problems associated with too much water in the wrong place? Approximately a dozen years. So the Intech Center is focusing on three aspects of reducing flood risk within the context of urban or suburban communities. First, we're working on programs pertaining to how to reduce flooding at the level of the individual house, the lot level. What are the initiatives you can take around the outside of the property to limit the probability of water getting into the basement? And then if water were to get in a basement, what are the actions you can take to limit the amount of damage that would be realized? So that's one level of focus. Next, we're focusing on flood risk mitigation at the level of new residential community design. How do we build new residential communities in Canada with fundamental features or characteristics in place that make it such that when the big floods or storms hit going forward, the entire community isn't flooding out? Homeowners don't realize a flooded basement. Third, we focus on flood risk mitigation for existing communities. What do we do for the communities already built? They're up and running. How do we get flood risk out of the system there? How do we use berms, diversion channels, holding ponds, cisterns, bioswales, permeable surfacing within communities? How do we deploy these features practically and cost effectively to overall lower the probability of flooding occurring in these communities? So effectively, we're working on a package deal, if you will, on flood risk mitigation at the level of the home, the individual house, new community design, and existing communities. The biggest problem we're facing probably, or certainly right at the top of the list, is complacency. We're not moving quick enough to operationalize programs to attenuate or limit the amount of flooding that otherwise is going to continue to occur. And people have to understand that the weather of the past is not a predictor of the weather of the future. So because someone's lived in a community, let's say for 20 or 30 years, and quite logically based on that, if they've never seen flooding, their expectation going forward is, I probably never will. But the reality of the situation is that the dynamic of the system has changed. The weather itself has actually changed. So even if you haven't seen flooding in your community in past history, that is not a predictor that you're not going to see it going forward. So what we have to do is operationalize flood risk mitigation in the immediate term quickly. Time is not a luxury. Every day we don't adapt is a day we don't have. There's a number of initiatives that can be engaged and are really underway that bring flood risk awareness to the fore, to the attention of homeowners. For example, right now in Canada, from Halifax to Victoria, within cities, there's a growing degree to which homeowners can no longer get insurance coverage for flooding in basements. No matter if the water flowed up through the sewer system and through the little drain in your basement during a major storm, that's one form of flooding for which there's a specific insurance product. Or water could flow through the side window of your house, flood your basement. That's called overland flooding, another product that can be purchased by the homeowner. Many people in cities across Canada now are finding out that, boy, I can't get insurance coverage for either one of these two phenomena, or the amount of coverage I can get is for a very limited amount of money or costly stress to the system. And with the average cost of a flooded basement in Canada being somewhere in the order of about $43,000, it's a really big deal if you've got a basement full of sewer water and no insurance coverage. So that brings attention to homeowners. And very often, even if people still can get or have insurance coverage, they may know someone who doesn't. And they're saying, gee, I don't want to end up in that situation. So this can be a driver for them to say, I better engage all the activities I can around my house to not have a flooded basement. Plus, we're bringing the attention and the phenomena of basement flooding to the fore of real estate agents who can start to flag these issues when someone's purchasing a home and say, you know, let's do an assessment here to see whether or not there's any probability of this basement flooding in this house that you're about to buy, which for most people is the largest investment decision they'll ever make in their lives. And quite frankly, this is their retirement fund. They want to make sure they get that right. And then when they go to get a mortgage, increasingly so, they're going to be asked by mortgage providers, have you done an assessment pertaining to the probability of having a flooded basement? Because if anybody were ever to default on a mortgage, the mortgage holders, they don't want to be finding themselves holding the mortgages on literally toxic properties. So the whole phenomena of an increasing frequency with which people are realizing flooded basements in the country through a variety of mechanisms, this is coming to the understanding of homeowners. Well, in just sticking with flooding for the moment, what we need to do is get people to understand, and that's individual homeowners, mayors, councillors, and so forth, that how easy it is to take risk out of the system in reference to the probability of realizing a basement flood, how we can avoid that through simple actions and initiatives. Because right now, a lot of people think, well, this is just a fait accompli. A big storm hits, we get flooded out, there's nothing I can do about it. And what people need to realize is, no, that is not the case. Through simple initiatives that a person can engage around their house, generally on a Saturday and maybe a Sunday morning, without special expertise, it can be the difference between having a $40 or $50 or $100,000 basement flood versus not. They can put these measures in place for virtually next to no money, and it's initiatives as simple as perhaps disconnecting the downspout that comes from the eaves trough system. If that disappears into the ground, into the weeping tile system, cut that off, put an elbow on it, direct water a few meters away from the foundation of the house to a safe location. Putting plastic covers over window wells, making it such that when the big storms hit, the water doesn't fill the window well and subsequently flow into the basement. Let's make sure that windows at grade level, if water does get up to them, that the windows are watertight, they're water sealed, they can't get into the basement. Even the grading around the house, make sure the water flows away from the foundation versus towards it. Now, if water were to get into the basement, you want to make sure that, for example, if you have a sub pump, that you've checked the sub pump before the big storm occurs to make sure it works, that it's not seized up. You've dumped a bucket of water in there and seen it turn on and pump water out. You want to make sure that you have battery backup supply for that sub pump. So through a little kit of a few $100s available from any of the major hardware type stores around, you can hook up a battery backup supply to your sub pump to make sure that when the big storms hit, if the electricity goes out, you still have a means to run the sub pump. You want to make sure that you have your valuables up off the basement floor, put in plastic containers up out of harm's way, even if water got up high, such that you don't lose those valuables. So people have to realize that for very little money, very little effort, you can protect your basement from ultimately realizing a massive flood, protect the investment that is your primary investment vehicle in life. And I often find it perplexing that many people put more effort into planning their vacations than they do into planning around their house and putting initiatives around their house in place that can really protect their key investment in life. Step number one, most important, is find out what am I covered for by way of insurance. Most people have no idea what insurance coverage they have in reference to a flooding basement. Am I covered for sewer backup flooding? Am I covered for overland flooding? To what degree, if I am covered, am I covered? So step number one is tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, if you're a homeowner, call your insurance broker, your insurance provider, and find out in simple, straightforward, plain language, what am I covered for versus not, and do I require more coverage? leaders and people in positions of influence that actually can be backers of programs to operationalize adaptation to climate change and ultimately flooding at the community or the home level, they need to understand that there are practical, meaningful, cost-effective steps that can be operationalized today to make it such that the probability of someone going forward by putting these steps in place, the probability of them realizing a flooded basement is much lower than if they didn't put these measures in place. And ultimately, this is not the physics of curved space. We actually know what to do to operationalize these changes today. Will it be a perfect answer? The answer is no. But for a day or two worth of effort on a scale of 0 to 100, say 100 being the worst for the probability of realizing a basement flood, we can take a home from an 80 down to a 20 very, very quickly. And this is what people of influence that have a sphere of influence in government, whether it's mayors or councillors or premiers or whoever it might be, they need to understand that, and they need to back programs, educational programs and outreach programs to homeowners to let them know that, by the way, these are to a large extent solvable problems. We have the expertise to help you deploy to solve that problem, and collectively we can work together to deploy these programs in quick time. Climate change and the expression of extreme weather events, they're on the rise. That's the bottom line. Flooding occurring more frequently with greater magnitude. We're now experiencing heat wave, and flooding, by the way, globally, not just in Canada. We're experiencing heat waves around the world and in Canada. We're experiencing forest fires in Canada to a greater extent than we used to in the past. We are now seeing climate change in action. This is what climate change looks like in action. It is still difficult, though, in many cases, to convince people that this is climate change. There are a lot of people out there who do not believe climate change is real, never mind human-induced. But increasingly so, we are migrating in the direction that people are realizing that since through the burning of fossil fuels, we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, we're now seeing the expression of that change manifested in the form of extreme weather events. And now the trick is to get people to move on adaptation in the immediate term. We do not have the luxury of time on the adaptation file, and so it still is a struggle to get various aspects and factions of governments on board in particular to help support these efforts. The Intact Center, over the course of the last couple of years, has been running something called the Home Flood Protection Program, where that amounted to outreach into communities with properly trained people to meet with homeowners to explain to them and then subsequently explain flood risk to them and assess their homes for the degree of preparedness that they have in place or not that could affect the probability of having a flooded basement. Then based on that work, after applying that program to hundreds and hundreds of homes in various localities across the country, we established a very solid base of what typically is wrong with homes that needs to be corrected ultimately to not realize a flooded basement. We then took that material, packaged it up, and used it as the foundation or the seed document, if you will, that ultimately led to the creation of a basement flood risk guideline or standard developed by Canadian Standards Association. And that whole process was supported by a combination of the National Research Council, Standards Council of Canada, Canadian Standards Association, working very closely with the Intact Centre, and then we brought together a group of probably 40 or 50 prominent stakeholders, builders, developers, insurance people, conservation authorities, climate experts from across the country to ultimately take that core piece or document of information we had developed on home flood protection, combine it with the collective expertise of the other people that came to the table to ultimately develop this standard or guideline. And over the course of about 18 months to 24 months, we produced what has now come out as a basement flood protection guideline through CSA. One of the key areas in reference to the recommendations in the report to the federal government and ultimately the Minister of Environment was to operationalize best practices within urban and suburban areas that address flood risk mitigation at the level of the house, new community design, and existing communities. So areas for which the government itself is deeply invested in, primarily through the National Research Council and Standards Council of Canada. But also what we focused on in that report quite a bit, and it's an area that hasn't drawn enough attention in the country to date, but for which the federal government itself is interested, certainly, is also considering the state of disenfranchisement realized by Indigenous peoples in this country, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, who are being affected by climate change, extreme weather events, flooding being one of them, but certainly in the far north, in addition to the expression of extreme weather risk in the form of flooding, we're also realizing permafrost loss, which is affecting the structural integrity of buildings in the north. As the frost comes out of the ground, it melts. We're having foundations collapse. We're losing ice roads in the north that First Nations communities have largely been dependent on for shipping fuel, food, clothing in and out of communities. We're losing those ice roads. Loss of ice is affecting the time of year that people can go out onto the ice to engage in traditional hunting that supports them, that food stock for the rest of the year. So in this report, we spent quite a bit of time talking about and emphasizing aspects of the challenges being faced by Indigenous peoples in the far north. One aspect of that is, yes, flood related, but also considering a range of other challenges that they're facing as well. And I will say that this input on the part of the federal government is very positively received. The federal government of Canada, is, in my opinion at least, is very committed to helping Indigenous peoples in this country not realize the state of disenfranchisement they've realized to date. When I talk to the students about climate change, extreme weather risk, I present it to them to a large extent in the context that adaptation properly applied is simply good and smart business. It's good and smart governance. No matter how you slice it, by taking risk out of the system, that serves everybody's interests well, whether it's government, whether it's industry, whether it's individual homeowners. At any level, being ahead of the curve on the climate file is a good place to be, particularly in reference to adaptation. And one of the points I try to highlight all the time is that by spending a few dollars here, we save hundreds of dollars there. The multiplier effect of return on investment associated with climate change adaptation is phenomenal. It's off the charts, it's logarithmic. And that's a point we have to get across to people to say, when they say, well, what would this program cost and who's gonna pay for it and so forth? We have to get people to understand that if we don't fix it now, we're gonna have to fix it later at much, much greater cost. So that's one point. And number two, we have to dispel the notion that adaptation is always expensive. When you're building new or you have a scheduled retrofit, the cost of building something right under the umbrella of adaptation is more or less the same as the cost of building it wrong. But if you build it wrong and then later have to retrofit to upgrade the facility, you have to tear it all apart and build it again the way you should have built it in the first place, it's enormously costly. So if we're building a new subdivision going forward, just as per example, and we're putting in piping for sewer discharge that's, let's say, 15 centimeters in diameter. When you've done all the other preparatory work, the blueprint work, the construction work, the site preparation to put the piping in place, it almost costs just a dinky fraction more in terms of money to put a 30 centimeter diameter pipe in place versus a 15 centimeter diameter pipe. But the 30 centimeter diameter pipe has 4 times the discharge capacity on water than the 15 centimeter diameter pipe. Therefore, why not hedge our bets in favor of preparing for extreme weather events, have a no regrets policy, and put the proper facility in place? I have seen neighbors flood it. I haven't experienced flooding, which is probably a good thing considering I run the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. But I have certainly seen neighbors and or relatives experience flooding, gone to their house pretty quickly thereafter, identified what the source of the problem was and fixed it right on the spot. And in almost every single case, what I find is these people are surprised at how simple the fix could be relative to the amount of stress they're now realizing as per the flood they realized. People are better preparing for flooding than occurred in the past. However, we are a funny species. Generally, it takes getting hit once and sometimes even twice to realize that this isn't going to go away, that preparedness is the place to be. And very often we can be victims of our history. If we haven't experienced a phenomena to date, we think we probably won't realize it going forward. If we do realize one hit going forward, sometimes we'll think, well, that was just a one-off, an anomalous event that really isn't meaningful and probably won't be repeated. But then it gets repeated. And that's when people start to get religion on the file. But I am noticing now, increasingly so, that even if people haven't been hit with flooding, but they know someone in their church group or that I work with or whatever it might be that have been hit, they're starting to better prepare now proactively and say, I don't want to end up in that situation. Absolutely, categorically. For people who have experienced a flooded basement, almost always when you talk to them afterwards, and we actually did a study to address this issue, we found, to my surprise, that even 3 years later, 3 years after they had experienced a flood, they would still reference the fact that a husband and wife will say something like, every time we have a big storm, my husband and I are up in the night 3 times checking the basement to see if there's water in it. We don't sleep well that night when there's a big storm on. And that's not just a month after they experienced a basement flood. This was 3 years later. So this has become a new way that they live with this stress that's ongoing. So it's a terrible way to live. So again, everything points into the direction that you're far better off to not have the flood in the first place. No, the vast majority of time, when people put the measures in place in reference to preparedness to not have a flooded basement, all the types of initiatives that we've been talking to, they will come back after and say, on my street, we had a major precipitation event, a major storm. 3 of the neighbors realized a flooded basement. My basement was bone dry with these features in place, and I know for sure, had I not done that, I would have been flooded out as well. And it's interesting that you can actually go onto a street where I have done it myself and looked at where flood prevention measures have been put in place and where they haven't. And indeed, after a major storm occurs, I don't even have to knock on the door to remind myself or check notes as to which ones had the flood mitigation measures put in place versus not, because when I drive up, I can see for the house that didn't do it, their carpeting, their furniture, everything is sitting out on the boulevard soaked. You pretty much, there's the evidence. The key piece of information, in my opinion, is to convey to homeowners that when you're about to make the biggest investment decision of your life, and this will ultimately be, for most people, their retirement fund, you want to put every measure in place to ensure the security of that investment. And the application of adaptation measures applied on the outside of the property and inside helps secure that investment. It will retain the value of your home. It will support the value of your home. And people need to understand that very, very clearly. They also need to understand that climate change is real. It has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. Climate change is irreversible. And the degree to which we're realizing flooding today pales in comparison to the stressors that are coming in the future.